Hello, scholars. Welcome. Chapter 13, Oceanography. We're diving right into biological productivity, energy transfer, and you could even say nutrient cycling. So let's head right in. We're looking at the various control mechanisms on marine primary productivity, or you could also call that photosynthesis, because the main source of energy for all life on Earth comes from the sun. There's also Earth's internal heat that provides a source of energy, but the sun, photosynthesis, that's what's making it happen. It's kind of a big deal. We'll look at how productivity is a feature that happens globally and how it varies by season. It also varies by latitude. We'll look at feeding relationships, food chains, or more realistically, food webs, because as much as we try and simplify things to understand them, the Earth is much more complex. And last but not least, we'll look at marine fisheries, some issues that are happening with them, and potential solutions for management that we can help support the health of our marine environments. Great. So primary productivity is the rate at which energy is stored in organic matter, and it happens through the process of photosynthesis, where autotrophs, or organisms that can produce their own glucose, their own sugar, take carbon dioxide, water, and light. They produce sugars, and a byproduct is O2, oxygen into the atmosphere. And so we have a lot to think. You and I have a lot to think. We might be breathing oxygen right now that was produced, well, it was a waste product, in effect, of plankton that are floating in the ocean utilizing the sun's energy. We could also call them phytoplankton. So thank you to the teeny tiny little diatoms which are helping to support our lives in this very moment. There's also chemosynthesis, accounting for a very small portion of it, and this is specific archaea which live on hydrothermal vents. There's no light down there, deep down in the ocean at these submarine volcanic ridge centers, and they're pretty great. But the archaea don't need light. They don't photosynthesize. They use the chemicals that are filtering through these hydrothermal vents, white smokers, black smokers, and then they become the source of food for the heterotrophs that consume then to support these hydrothermal vent ecosystems. There's this really amazing balance that happens. As an animal, I breathe in oxygen, I give off CO2. Photosynthesizers breathe in CO2, they give out oxygen. So nutrient cycling, there's this amazing balance where autotrophs release oxygen into the environment, animals release carbon dioxide into the environment, and through the process of respiration, transpiration, photosynthesis, there is stability on our Earth, and there's enough to go around for everyone. Really cool, the interaction of photosynthesis with carbon dioxide. Okay, so if we're thinking about primary productivity in the oceans, starting with plankton, drifters, photosynthesizers, phytoplankton, lots of names for them, how do we know how much is out there? Well, one way is to take a plankton net, scoop them up, and then filter out and see how much plankton in that unit of measure is. This is very specifically designed to collect a sample on a very specific portion of seawater. You can also measure the uptake of radioactive carbon by phytoplankton in a sample as another way to get a surrogate for how much plankton is in the ocean. So this is point sampling. It's figuring out how much plankton is at a certain place. Well, what if we want to know about the entire ocean, which we do? We would like to have a comprehensive understanding of what is the primary productivity, where does primary productivity take place? And so the moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer, a really cool satellite that collects a ton of data. Well, it also measures the color of the ocean's surface, and phytoplankton give off a slightly greenish color because of a green pigment called chlorophyll. It's what gives plants their green color. Places without phytoplankton have a deeper, richer blue. Places with phytoplankton have more of a green color. So we can use satellite data to predict or estimate the relative abundance of phytoplankton distributed throughout the world's oceans. Pretty cool. Satellites are awesome. So what affects primary productivity? Two things. What do phytoplankton need? They need one, sunlight. Phytoplankton. Photosynthesis needs the sun. It's a big one. Two, nutrients. Primary productivity needs nutrients to support the organisms which are reproducing. Specifically, nitrogen, phosphorus in the form of nitrates and phosphates, also iron and silica. A lot of these nutrients are delivered to the oceans from the weathering and erosion of continental rocks being transported by rivers. Rivers bring fresh nutrients to the oceans. Decomposers at the bottom of the ocean, they also transform, they cycle nutrients to be reused by these organisms, which is why coastal or just upwelling in general is so important, and areas of deep current upwelling are biological hotspots because they bring all those nutrients up to the surface. Nitrates, phosphates, fertilizers are placed on fields because our modern techniques of agriculture deplete soil of their resources. But we want to keep growing things. So what to do? Fertilize the fields. This has been happening for as long as agriculture has been developed. It used to be a process where animal husbandry, bringing your animals integrally into your farm so that their manure could bring those nutrients back into the soil, was of utmost importance. Now, synthetic fertilizers. Using way too many. What happens? Those synthetic fertilizers, when it rains, wash into water courses. Those water courses deliver those excess nutrients to the ocean, causing harmful algae blooms that deplete the water of oxygen, creating hypoxic conditions. We'll talk a lot about this, and you've probably heard it before, but this is the process of eutrophication, the enrichment of an ecosystem with chemical nutrients leading to a massive algae bloom. Sunlight is really important for photosynthesis. In fact, it's crucial. At a certain depth, around 100 meters, sunlight doesn't make its way down into the water column anymore. Now, that's not very far, considering the depth of the world's oceans are pretty deep in some places. Tens of thousands of feet, 330 feet. The euphotic zone before, the aphotic zone below, not enough light penetrating into water underneath what's called the compensation depth. So that means that primary productivity of phytoplankton happens at a very shallow surface within the world's oceans. Light has really awesome effects. It can transmit through the water in a certain way. The sun affects the water column in three specific ways. Differential heating because of the Earth's tilt on an axis and orbit around the sun create seasons. Those seasons create differential heating of land and water, which leads in turn to convection cells, which creates ocean winds, major wind belts that interact in the air-sea interface to create major ocean currents on the surface. Well, the oceans are also stratified. Stratified, as we saw, a thin layer of surface water can be warmer than the water below in what's called a thermocline. We've talked about this, the thermocline, the pycnocline. They come back in today, really, really important. And then also, the sun affects where primary productivity occurs. Photosynthesis only occurs where sunlight penetrates ocean water. Let's talk about light a little bit. The electromagnetic spectrum are a series of waves that the sun delivers from short wavelength, low energy, short wavelength, low energy to high wavelength, high energy. Okay, so what does that mean? What we see is visible light, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. We don't see radio waves, which we can tune into on the dial in our car. We don't see X-rays, which can be harmful. Ultraviolet rays, also harmful. That's why O3 in the stratosphere, the ozone layer, so important. It blocks out harmful ultraviolet rays. Sunscreen on your skin can also help to protect against some harmful rays from the sun. But the electromagnetic spectrum has what's called visible light. And when visible light hits the ocean does cool things. It absorbs different wavelengths or different colors at different depths. So we can see red, orange, and yellow are preferentially absorbed first, so is violet. And then it oscillates between blue and green. Blue makes its way the furthest down into the water column, which is why the oceans are blue. They don't reflect, or oceans don't just reflect blue scattered light from the atmosphere. Totally different process. It's not reflection and scattering, it's absorption in the ocean. Awesome. If we want to know how transparent the water is, well, we can get together, hop on a boat, grab this reflective disc called a Secchi disc, drop it into the water, and see how long we can see it. And then measure that. That is going to give an idea of what the water's transparency is. Well, what affects transparency? Turbidity, which is sediment particles that cloud up the water. Photosynthetic pigment or chlorophyll, i.e. phytoplankton. So again, we get back to, if we've got a satellite measuring color of the oceans, well, the greener the oceans are, the greater the amount of photosynthetic pigment is located in that water. Thus, it's a direct surrogate for what is the quantities of primary producers in these locations. Pretty cool. Color is going to, so productivity needs two things, sunlight and nutrients. We know that in areas of upwelling, fresh supplies of nutrients are delivered to the surface because that's where it's happening, that's where the sunlight is. Awesome. In these areas, the water turns a little bit greener, a light green. We call it eutrophic waters. Areas that don't have nutrients get this deep, dark blue, and we call this oligotrophic. Names based on productivity reflected in the color of the water that you can observe on the surface. Following? Yes? Awesome. Where are the highest productivity centers? Well, they often have to do with continental margins or ocean margins. There's stresses on coastal organisms at shallow water depths that allow for seasonal temperature variations, salinity variations, causing mixing, causing the right environments of sunlight and nutrients to happen. Because remember, what does primary production need? Sunlight and nutrients. Big take-home message here. Upwelling in places like right along the equator. So between the tropics in general is not an area of high productivity. A little counterintuitive because it's such a biodiversity hotspot. But because of such a strong thermocline, the nutrients stay at the bottom, the light stays at the top. You only get 1 or 2 ingredients. But right along the equator, there's the equatorial convergence that allows for upwelling to occur. Awesome. That provides colder, deeper seawater. Colder, deeper seawater brings in nutrient-rich sources. So what is photosynthesizing in the ocean? Well, all kinds of stuff. Little drifters, phytoplankton. We've got seed-bearing plants. Now, plants aren't that common in the ocean. Very common on land, but not super common. Lots of other things. And in fact, if you remember from marine life, there's way more different types of land species than there are ocean species because of the relatively stable environment that doesn't force, or I should say promote, natural selection in oceans the way that it does on land. There's macroscopic algae, microscopic algae, and then teeny tiny little picoplankton, photosynthetic bacteria. So we see Anthophyta, cone-bearing plants, primarily grasses and mangroves. These are an important food source. They also provide protection for the near-shore environment, creating habitats. Mangrove forests, awesome, super cool. Their roots grow straight down into salt water. They're specially adapted, amazing. Certain seagrasses also can do this same thing. Macroscopic algae, macro meaning big enough that you and I can see, designated by color. Green algae, red algae, brown algae. You can see here the little air sacs, so the brown algae can actually float. Really fun if you're ever walking along the beach and you think, oh gosh, look at all this marine pollution. It's not pollution, it's just seaweed. It's not harming the environment, so it's not seaweed. You just might want a cleaner sand beach. Anyways, little air sacs in these seaweeds, you can go pop, pop. It's kind of fun to smash them underneath your heels. A little poof of air shoots out of them. Anyways, really, really fun. Microscopic, we're getting back to plankton. Microscopic plankton, we've got golden algae, diatoms, coccolithophores. So what do these make? When so they're covered in a siliceous or calcareous test, a shell. When those sink to the bottom, they become biogenous sediments. Those biogenous sediments can accumulate over time, compaction, cementation, lithification, and then they become diatomaceous earth or chalk, just like the chalk on a chalkboard, coccolithophores. So not only are they providing oxygen for the environment when they were alive, they're providing us a really cool thing to write on chalkboards with now that they've been dead a very, very long time. Dinoflagellates can be harmful in certain quantities because they produce toxins that can kill fish and contribute to this phenomenon called a red tide. Now, red tides are harmful algal blooms, or also known as HABs, because these microscopic floating photosynthesizers are algae. Here's a red tide, harmful algal bloom, dinoflagellate. The fish can eat this, and then humans who eat the fish can go into this symptom of paralytic shellfish poisoning, PSP, that basically shuts down your system, and it's not good. So we want to be weary of environmental hazards such as red tides, which are a natural phenomenon, but also have been expedited and have a greater effect because of eutrophication and the extensive nutrients that are being dumped into aquatic, or I should say marine ecosystems. Dinoflagellates can take lots of pathways to humans. They can get into bivalves, clams, mussels, scallops. We eat those. Crabs, whelks, drills. We eat those. They can get into zooplankton, which are eaten by fish, which we eat those. They can get into fish, which again marine mammals or seabirds, so they can really, really affect the environment in a variety of ways. And they're associated with the seafood poisoning called ciguatera. When it happens in a person, you think that they're suddenly drunk because they lose control of their ability to talk, and they seem inebriated. So if you're ever eating seafood and something funny happens, you probably have consumed too many dinoflagellates. Algae toxins have this domoic acid. This is the toxin, was the basis of Alfred Hitchcock's 1961 movie The Birds, because the birds ate the fish and they got all drunk with the dinoflagellates and started attacking people, and oh my gosh, kind of a fun thought for a story of fiction rooted in truth, science fiction, you could say. In 2008, China was on board to host a sailing competition for the Olympics, but the bay where it was supposed to happen got completely covered with algae. So they spent tens of millions of dollars, hired thousands of people to come out, scoop the algae out so that they could actually hold the competition, which they did. This happened because excess sewage, fertilizer, and animal waste was dumped into the bay. Nutrients caused a harmful algal bloom, which basically cuts off sunlight, kills the plants in the bottom, all the algae dies, settles in the bottom, decomposers, they do their thing, they decompose, they use up the remaining oxygen, no more oxygen in the water. This is called cultural eutrophication, the speeding up of natural eutrophication through human activities, specifically waste, sewage, sludge, trash, and agriculture through fertilizers. I kind of just mentioned this, but it creates dead zones where you have river water coming in, an algae bloom. This algae takes up oxygen, removes oxygen. The algae dies, settles to the bottom. Bacterial composition uses up excess O2, and then what's left is a very low oxygen or hypoxic waters that cannot support the marine life that was there previously and needs oxygen to survive. Globally, this creates dead zones, and it sounds bad because it is. A dead zone is an area where marine life dies because of eutrophication. When there's no oxygen in waters where species have evolved to survive on oxygen, it creates these hotspots of dead zones. One of the largest ones in the Gulf of Mexico happens every single year. There's natural dead zones that happen. Yes, this is a natural process, but it's heavily influenced by human influence and human activity that now create this phenomenon that's seen at the mouth of many major rivers all over the world. The Gulf of Mexico is the second largest in the world, and you can see that every single summer, a tremendously large dead zone occurs. We know how this goes, eutrophication. If we look here, why does this happen? Because the Mississippi River watershed, the Mississippi River basin, expands almost half the country, maybe more, and there's a lot of farming that happens in the Great Plains, in this Great Plains region. With all that farming, all that fertilizer, all those nutrients get into waterways, make their way to the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River, thus the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Here we can see anoxic or hypoxic, both words meaning no oxygen, water. So what is there to do? What should we do? Treat the water? How about best management practices on land? Control the nutrient runoff. Use less fertilizers. Preserve the wetlands because they're natural buffers, natural filtration systems. Plant rows of trees between crops. Plant rows of trees between fields and rivers. Rotate crops. Cover crops. Utilize cover crops. Nature's pretty smart. In fact, ecosystems have been thriving and been very resilient for millions of years, and modeling what ecosystems do is a pretty good idea. It's becoming more well understood that photosynthetic bacteria play a huge role in supporting Earth's atmosphere, oxygen. Now we're starting to understand that at least half the world's ocean's photosynthetic biomass comes from these microscopic photosynthetic bacteria. Awesome. We're learning so much, and there's still so much more to learn, which is really awesome about the ocean. It's still a frontier area of research. Primary productivity changes through ecosystems in oceans on land. It's highest in algae beds and coral reefs. Hotspots of biological productivity where phytoplankton can reproduce at astronomical levels. 90% of the biomass comes from euphotic zones, and then this decomposes before it descends. So a very small amount of that biomass actually makes it to the surface, the ocean bottom, to become biogenous sediments. So a lot of that, those nutrients become matter. That matter decomposes, becomes nutrients again, and the circle of life continues in such a beautiful way. We see three distinct regions. So let's think about, where is primary productivity happening? Where is the most biological productivity going to happen? Well, there's three main regions. There's polar, temperate or mid-latitude, tropical or low latitude. And they're each different because of the features of surface and deep ocean currents dictated by latitude and the supply of nutrients. Let's look at each of them. Polar. The poles are isothermal and isopycnal, meaning the water column with depth does not change its temperature or change its salinity. So there's a free flow of mixing that can happen. Nutrients can make their way to the surface. So there's one part of the equation, sunlight. Well, we know that at the poles and in the Arctic Circle, for half of the year, there is no sunlight. But when the sun does come out, then you have both ingredients, sunlight and nutrients. This causes an explosion, a bloom of phytoplankton, specifically in diatoms. Zooplankton are herbivores that eat the algae. There's a lag time, but as soon as the diatom bloom happens, the zooplankton bloom happens, and food webs, these support, they're very low levels, trophic levels that support larger organisms. So awesome. Polar areas are going to have high productivity. Antarctic productivity is slightly greater than the Arctic. The North Atlantic deep water upwells near Antarctica, and productivity decreases from UV radiation in the ozone hole. So not only does the ozone hole affect us, it affects marine life, and if it affects marine life, then again, it affects us. Isothermal. Plankton remain at the surface. Blue whales migrate to feed on the maximum zooplankton productivity, specifically little crustaceans called krill. They grow really fast. The krill eat the phytoplankton, and blue whales, biggest organism in the ocean. They're humongous. So think about how much biomass they must have to eat in order to get that big. It's a lot. It would be like you being 60 feet tall and eating ants to grow that big. You'd have to eat a lot of ants. Blue whales have to eat a lot of zooplankton. That must mean there's a lot of zooplankton. So now we're putting biomass in perspective of how much is actually out there in the vastness of the oceans. Awesome. Let's go to the tropics. So there's a very specific thermocline. There's a mixed layer of warm, nutrient-depleted surface water. There's cold, nutrient-rich deep water, but they don't mix. Because they don't mix, there's a lack of nutrients. So tropics have a lack of nutrients, except for right around the equator, there's a very small band. The equator, Coriolis effects, turns north hemisphere to the right, southern hemisphere to the left, creates equatorial upwelling. Similar things happen along coasts. So even though, for the most part, the tropics aren't an entire band of biological productivity, there's areas right along the equator, at coasts, coastal margins. Coral reefs can create their own nutrient recycling within the specific ecosystem that they're supporting. And then we get to mid-latitudes, temperate. And so what's going on here is you have shifting sunlight through the seasons, shifting temperatures through the seasons. Excuse me. Too excited. So at certain points, the water column is isothermal in winter. As you move to summer, the thermocline develops, and it becomes very strong in summer, and then it starts to fade in the fall. So what this does is it provides twice a year, spring and autumn, the right ingredients of sunshine and nutrients, supporting a spring bloom and a fall bloom. Wow, pretty cool. Okay, and this is going to be happening at temperate latitudes. Here's a little zoom in. We've got middle latitude, tropical comparisons. So we can see tropical have a lower biomass than polar. Mid-latitude, green line mid-latitude with its double bloom. Tropical, pretty low. Polar, huge spike when the sun comes out. Variable biological productivity by latitude because of the intricacies. And it all comes back to our place in the universe. Wow. Okay, let's tie this one in. Because we have our sun and we are so far away from it, tilted at an angle, rotating on an axis, revolving around the sun once every 365 days, we get these complex interactions that help to dictate the production of ocean marine life. That is awesome. Let's keep going. Energy flows in ecosystems. The primary source of all life on Earth is the sun. Energy moves from the sun, feeds the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton feed the zooplankton. They're eaten by carnivores, primary. Those are eaten by something else, and those are eaten by something else. And you get about 3 levels up of consumers, and you get large mammals like sharks. Awesome. Okay, so all of the life is called the biotic community, but the life, the rocks, the skeletons, the water, the gases, everything else together forms the ecosystem. Energy is unidirectional from the sun through the various trophic levels. Marine ecosystems have 3 main features to them. Producers, and we're thinking about energy flow. Energy flows from the sun to the producers. Producers are then consumed by consumers. When any of these die, consumers or producers, they are then broken down by decomposers. So the matter and the nutrients are cycled, but the energy is unidirectional and it's lost to entropy, it's lost to heat as we go from place to place. Consumers can be herbivores, eating plants, carnivores, eating animals, omnivores, eating plants or animals, or bacteriivores, eating bacteria. When producers or consumers die, they become detritus, the dead remains, or waste products. Adding to this nutrient cycling is called a biogeochemical cycle. The chemical part of matter are cycled through the ecosystem, through the living and the non-living components. The water, the soil, or I guess here it would be the marine sediments. The marine life, living and non-living, nutrients make their way through. Chemical components make their way through. So marine life has adapted, consumers have adapted ways of eating, and it's pretty cool. Suspension feeding or filter feeding is where certain organisms take in seawater, they filter out the usable organic material. They'll filter the plankton that's floating in the water column. So that's pretty cool. Suspension feeding. Organisms can be underneath the ground and literally siphon the water and expel processed water out. They can, like the sandworm, can feed by ingesting sediment and extracting organic matter, leaving behind processed remains. Or you see the sea star here. It's a sand star eating a clam. So they can be carnivorous and capture and eat other animals. Wow, awesome. Lots of different ways for marine life to feed. As they feed, it goes up trophic levels, decreasing energy. Phytoplankton takes energy from the sun. Phytoplankton is eaten by herbivores. Herbivores are eaten by carnivores. You have a decrease of energy as you go up higher into the food chain. You also have marine species getting larger. We'll talk about animals of the pelagic and benthic environment in more detail, but for energy transfer, it decreases. As you have a decrease in energy, you have a decrease in the mass, you have an increase in the size. Pretty cool. This gives us a gross ecological efficiency. Not very efficient, in fact. Phytoplankton capture about 2% of the energy from the sun. 98% of it is lost. When it goes to the next trophic level, zooplankton, there's about 10% energy transfer. 90% is lost. Of that, you lose another 90% going to primary consumers, another 10%, 90% going to secondary, and then another 90% loss going to tertiary. So it's an incredible amount of loss. 500,000 units of radiant energy make its way through the trophic levels to 1 unit of energy at this keystone or apex predator species. Let's simplify things. A food chain. Diatoms feed a copepod, feed a herring. Primary producer, herbivore, carnivore. But life isn't that simple, because what if there weren't many copepods? Would all the herring die? Uh-oh. So what do we do here? Food webs. Herring eats sand eels, arrowworms, mollusk larvae, copepods, tunicates, amphipods, cladocerans. Many of these are fed by diatoms and dinoflagellates, by zooplankton, phytoplankton. Got it. Algae in the oceans. Perfect. And lots of things eat lots of other things. So it becomes this complex web. That way, if one source of food is gone, the whole thing doesn't come crashing down, especially for the consumer at the top of the food web. I alluded to this a moment ago, but there's much more biomass lower on the trophic level. But as biomass decreases, size increases. The top of the pyramid has the largest organisms, but the least amount of biomass. There's so much phytoplankton in the ocean. It's microscopic. It's a huge amount. What if there was trillions of sharks in the ocean? Well, the whole thing would come crashing down. They just eat everything. So deficiency. So there's energy conversion, energy loss, decrease in biomass, increase in size. Again, this is so cool how these oceans work. Okay, diving into our final topic, marine fisheries. Where are fish and what do we do with them? Well, most fish are on continental shelves, tropical shelves or non-tropical shelves, because there's sunlight there. And fish need to eat. They're consumers. They eat producers, and producers need sunlight on these shelves. Coastal and coral upwelling accounts for about 20%. Open ocean, not a ton of fish in the open ocean. Commercial fishing has a history of depleting ocean fisheries resources, and it's not good. We're not in a good place with marine fisheries. In fact, almost 80% of the fish or standing stock, the mass present in the ecosystem at any given time, has been overexploited, either depleted, over, or fully exploited. There's this idea of the maximum sustainable yield. It's, can we fish without depleting the supply, the standing stock? And that's fishing just enough so that the fish can reproduce. This would be sustainable fisheries. But it's not the history of what we've seen. 80% of world marine fishery stocks are fully exploited, or 523. We've decreased large predatory fish, increased fish production, and decreased stocks. This has actually changed the face of the oceans, decreasing the amount of large fish that are even there. So this is happening. This has happened. It's a real environmental issue that is pressing and needs your help, your knowledge, your power, your consumer care in selecting seafood that you eat that doesn't target some of these overexploited fisheries. So what happens is modern fishing has harvested most of the big fish. The big fish are the low-hanging fruit. Let's pick up the big fish. And it's prevented smaller fish from overpopulating, because big fish are important. They're keystone species that keep marine food webs in check. Same thing happens in coral reefs. When you remove the large predators, you remove the fish that eat algae that can cause harmful algal blooms, whole cascade of effects. Overfishing is a big problem, and we're on the right path. We're recognizing that it's a problem, enforcing and implementing policy, but the oceans are so big. They're just a huge area to have to monitor and to police, essentially, and there's a lot of bad things that are happening out there. So certain dire predictions have said that we could be out of fish in the ocean in 30 years. What would that do to the health of marine systems? Wow, I mean, fish are very resilient, but because of pollution and habitat loss, you have dead ecosystems that don't support life, rampant overfishing. It's not good news for marine fisheries. People also like to fish for fun. Catch and release can help to sustain populations, and it can also be detrimental based on the size and the number of recreational fish. But recreational fish doesn't have anything on commercial operations that basically destroy environments, scoop up large amounts of fish in huge nets, and cause devastation to these marine environments. So there's a reported catch. There was a study that said, well, okay, that's probably an underestimate because there's been limits, People are going to lie so they can make more money, and unfortunately, but such is the truth. And so we saw a global fish catch peak around the 90s. This is because the ocean started to get depleted. Not because all of a sudden we're like, oh, we're fishing too much, but there weren't any more fish to catch. And then, okay, so what do? Significant policy. We've got to make changes. How about limiting the number of fishing boats that are in the ocean? Because these large-scale fishing operations catch all kinds of other stuff that's not intended. It's called bycatch. Birds, turtles, dolphins, sharks, killing different animals in the ocean, decreasing the marine life biodiversity. This is not good. It's really sad. Dolphins have made a big comeback. It was found out that dolphins were being caught and killed in gill nets or drift nets, and there was a big public outcry. So we have consumer power to voice our opinions. If we care about the oceans and we care about ocean life, then we can help to enact change, just like for dolphins. Dolphins are now on the marine mammals list for protected species. It's illegal to catch and kill dolphins as bycatch of tuna, and it's a really great example of an environmental win. Hey, that's awesome. Unfortunately, there's fishing material that is just lost or discarded that continues to kill fish out in the ocean. It's called ghost fishing because these fish resources aren't being utilized. They're not being harvested. No one's eating this fish, and as long as this equipment is in the environment, it just persists killing different species. So there's solutions like, okay, what if we use biodegradable materials? There's how do we get through the world's biggest problems? Policy, innovation, technology, thought, and care. We got to care about these things. Care about our oceans. Care about the fish inside of them. We need the fish to have a good quality of life. I promise you this. So what can we do? Management, hard to do. 70% of Earth's surface is covered by the ocean. But who owns the ocean? International waters are hard to enforce. There's conflicting interests. Some governments want to fish more than others, and so what are we to do? Manage fisheries. Currently, governments subsidize fishing. In 2004, there was 4 million vessels in the world fishing fleet. 4 million boats. That's a lot of fishing. We've seen the number of fishing boats increase, and even getting all the way up to these super fishing boats. They're old oil tankers that just scoop all the fish out of the ocean. So, management, policy, thought and care. This is how we do it. We can see management, all the red is ineffective management. So we're not doing a good job as humans preserving, sustaining our world's fisheries. There's a lot of room for improvements to be had. Unfortunately, bottom dragging trawl nets destroy ecosystems, and getting rid of some of these practices is going to be crucial to preserving and sustaining our oceans, fisheries moving forward. We can vote with our wallet. We can stop buying fish that we know are overexploited. You can get the app on your phone that looks at the sustainability of different fish that you might be purchasing. Get a Marine Steward Council certified type of fish. Know if it's pole and line caught or if it's bottom trawled. So avoid overfished or depleted seafood. Care about what you eat. Care about yourself. Care about our oceans. This is ultimately where it comes back to for our fisheries management. Moving forward into the future, things are going to change with climate change, We haven't talked about that topic, but it's a big one. How does climate change? Of course, it's going to affect everything. We'll talk about that, a dedicated chapter here in a few lectures. That's everything I've got. That's a lot. Great job. Thank you for your attention. We learned a lot today, but the whole spectrum of biological productivity. I'm really proud of you, your dedication, your effort, your hard work. Keep it up. You're doing great. Thank you so much, and have a really nice day.